Guten Abend, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Im Namen der Körber-Stiftung heiße ich Sie ganz herzlich willkommen hier im Körber-Forum in Hamburg und natürlich genauso herzlich die Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer am Livestream zu unserer Veranstaltung mit dem Titel Das Ende der Gemeinschaft, Individualismus, Identitätspolitik und die Krise der liberalen Demokratie. Wir führen diese Veranstaltung durch in Zusammenarbeit mit dem Verlag Hoffmann und Campe und mit der Wochenzeitung Die Zeit. Vor 30 Jahren, im Sommer 1989, kurz vor dem Fall der Mauer, erschien in der amerikanischen Zeitschrift The National Interest ein Essay, dessen Titel Sie alle kennen: The End of History. Zumindest glauben Sie, dass Sie den Titel alle kennen, denn viele wissen nicht, am Ende dieses Titels stand ein Fragezeichen, also The End of History, question mark. Erst 3 Jahre später erschien dann das Buch mit dem Titel The End of History and the Last Man, dann ohne Fragezeichen. Ich vermute, das liegt einfach daran, dass man auch Buchtitel mit einem Fragezeichen nicht besonders gut verkaufen kann. Es ist sicherlich eines der erfolgreichsten politischen Sachbücher in den letzten 50 Jahren. Der Titel Ende der Geschichte machte wirklich Furore. Kein anderer Titel ist wahrscheinlich so oft zitiert worden, aber auch oft so verkürzt wiedergegeben worden wie der Titel Das Ende der Geschichte. Francis Fukuyama hat nämlich damals nicht gesagt, dass alle Staaten auf der Welt zu Demokratien werden. Und er hat auch nicht gesagt, dass die Geschichte zu Ende ist, in dem Sinn, dass auf der Welt nichts mehr passiert. Was er gesagt hat, ist, dass sich die Idee der liberalen Demokratie langfristig durchsetzen wird. Heute, 30 Jahre später, scheint es um die liberale Demokratie allerdings nicht allzu gut bestellt zu sein. Sie steckt in einer Krise. Eine wachsende Zahl von Menschen sympathisiert weltweit, auch in Europa, mit autoritären und mit illiberalen Herrschaftsformen. Starke Männer scheinen das Weltgeschehen zu dominieren: Erdogan, Xi, Putin, Orban, Bolsonaro und andere. Ein Viertel der 18- bis 29-jährigen Deutschen, so eine aktuelle Studie, wünschen sich einen starken Führer, der sich nicht um Parlamente und Wahlen kümmern muss. Das Thema Krise bestimmt auch die aktuelle Runde des Geschichtswettbewerbs des Bundespräsidenten und der Körber-Stiftung. Rund 5.500 Schülerinnen und Schüler haben sich in ca. 2.000 Beiträgen mit dem Thema So geht's nicht weiter, Krise, Umbruch, Aufbruch in den letzten Monaten auseinandergesetzt. Das ist ein absoluter Spitzenwert und zeigt aber auch, dass das Gefühl der Krise auch, vielleicht auch gerade in der jungen Generation, sehr stark wahrgenommen wird. Meine Damen und Herren, früher haben viele zum Sozialismus gesagt, eigentlich eine gute Idee, eine schöne Idee, aber schlecht gemacht, funktioniert irgendwie nicht. Das denken heute offenbar viele auch über die liberale Demokratie. Eine schöne Idee, aber die Wirklichkeit bleibt oft hinter dem Ideal weit zurück. So denken jedenfalls viele. Die große Frage, mit der sich nun alle beschäftigen, Politiker, Professoren, Publizisten, Stiftungen, lautet: Woran liegt das eigentlich? Was ist der Grund für die Distanz zur Demokratie, die offenbar immer mehr Menschen spüren? Der Titel des Buches von Francis Fukuyama, über das wir heute Abend sprechen werden und das vor wenigen Wochen erschienen ist, gibt direkt eine Antwort. Identität, wie der Verlust der Würde unsere Demokratie gefährdet. Was sich genau hinter diesem Titel verbirgt, darüber werden wir gleich mehr erfahren. Ich freue mich außerordentlich, dass der Autor dieses Buches heute Abend bei uns im Körber-Forum zu Gast ist. Meine Damen und Herren, heißen Sie mit mir herzlich willkommen Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama ist Direktor des Zentrums für Demokratie, Entwicklung und Rechtsstaatlichkeit an der Universität Stanford. Er ist Autor unzähliger Bücher und Studien und sicherlich einer der international bedeutendsten Vertreter der politischen Theorie unserer Zeit. Und als sein berühmter Essay 1989 veröffentlicht wurde, war er übrigens stellvertretender Leiter des Planungsstabes im amerikanischen Außenministerium. Moderiert wird der heutige Abend von Holger Stark. Holger Stark ist bei unserem Kooperationspartner Die Zeit Mitglied der Chefredaktion und Leiter des dortigen Investigativressorts. Auch Ihnen, Herr Stark, ein herzliches Willkommen. Ich danke ganz herzlich auch dem Verlag Hoffmann und Campe. Die Verlagsleiterin Birgit Schmitz ist heute bei uns für die gute Zusammenarbeit. Meine Damen und Herren, wie immer im Körperforum dürfen Sie nicht nur zuhören, sondern Sie können sich am Ende unserer Diskussion mit Fragen selbst einbringen. Wie immer müssen Sie auch nach der Veranstaltung nicht sofort nach Hause gehen, sondern wir laden Sie herzlich ein, bei einem Glas Wasser oder Wein das Gehörte weiter zu vertiefen. Und wer seinen Fukuyama von zu Hause heute mitgebracht hat, oder noch besser einen Fukuyama heute Abend an dem Büchertisch draußen käuflich erwirbt, der kann auch auf eine Widmung hoffen, denn Professor Fukuyama hat sich bereit erklärt, nach der Veranstaltung Bücher zu signieren. Das Beste kommt aber immer zum Schluss. Ich weiß nicht, ob Sie vorhaben, noch zu heiraten oder nochmal zu heiraten. Wenn nicht oder wenn ja, dann können Sie heute schon mal üben, denn es gibt da draußen so kleine rote und gelbe Zettelchen, da steht drauf, ja, ich will. Die liegen draußen auf diesen Stehtischen und wenn Sie so einen Zettel nehmen und umdrehen, dann können Sie Ihre E-Mail-Adresse draufschreiben, dann bekommen Sie regelmäßig das Programm des Körperforums zugeschickt, das vielleicht nicht in einer Ehe enden wird, aber zumindest in einer guten Freundschaft. Also nutzen Sie bitte diese Möglichkeit, wenn Sie noch nicht auf dem Verteiler stehen. Genug der Werbung, genug der Einführung. Ich danke Ihnen für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Professor Fukuyama, Sie haben das Wort. Dankeschön.
So thank you very much for coming tonight. It's a great honor to be here at the Körber Stiftung. And I'm grateful to my publisher, Hoffmann and Campe, and to Die Zeit for putting together this event. I don't want to say very much because I think we're going to have a good dialogue over the themes of my book. I'll just say a little bit about how this book came to be written. I was working on other issues. I teach about comparative politics and how political systems originate. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump was elected in 2016. I thought, like many Americans, that this was a disaster because, if you had to invent a human being who was less appropriate as President of the United States, you couldn't imagine somebody worse than Donald Trump. And how this came about and how so many millions of my fellow Americans could vote for and support, a person like this, just as a political scientist, struck me as a really, really big problem. And so I shifted a lot of my work to study this because it was part of a broader global trend towards populism that was going on in Turkey and Hungary and Poland, now, as you said, in Brazil and in Italy. And it looked like a very severe crisis of democracy. And so it actually was the occasion for me to return actually to some of the themes that I had started to write about all the way back in my book, The End of History and the Last Man. I appreciate the fact that you gave the entire title because many people did not read the Last Man part of that book. The Last Man was a reference. So The End of History comes from Hegel, but the Last Man comes from Nietzsche. Nietzsche said the last man is the creature who appears at the end of history, who has no aspirations because he's living in a world of consumer plenty and stability, and there's nothing further to struggle for. And I introduced this Greek word thumos, which in English is usually translated as spiritedness. This is the idea that we have within us a certain value or dignity, and we want other people to recognize that dignity. And what I said all the way back in 1991 was that this was a problem for democracy. Democracies actually grant dignity to people. They grant dignity to people by giving them rights. You have the right to speak, the right to belief, the right to associate, and most importantly, the right to vote. So you have a share of political power, but in many cases that's not enough, that we take these rights for granted and we want other forms of recognition, particularly in societies where there are inequalities, injustices, and people basically being disrespected and ignored. And what I said back, all the way back in that book, was, the last few chapters were, I guess, projections about threats to democracy and how what had seemed to be the consensus around democracy that emerged after the fall of the Berlin Wall, how that could come apart. And my view was it would be based on thumos. It would be based on this anger at non-recognition. It could take the form of nationalism, it could take the form of religion, or it could take the form of populism. I also actually mentioned Donald Trump in that original book. I forgot that I had done this until somebody pointed this out to me. So I went back and read what I had written, and I said that I said the following: that one of the advantages of a democracy, a liberal democracy, tied to a capitalist economic system is that if you get a tremendously ambitious individual who could be a threat to the political order, to the democratic political order, that person could make a lot of money in the private economy, and that would satisfy their desire for recognition. They could be the richest person or the biggest real estate developer or whatever. And I said, it looked like that's what happened with Donald Trump. You get this very rich guy, and he's content to be, a billionaire, and that's that, so he's not going to be a threat. Well, here we are, 30 years later, and it turns out it wasn't enough for him. In fact, we don't really know whether he's as rich as he claims he is, but it obviously wasn't enough, and he wanted political power as well. And so we're in this very interesting test of our political system, because our American founding fathers created the Constitution precisely to guard against someone like Donald Trump, somebody ambitious that would threaten the democratic system because that ambition would lead them to concentrate power in the presidency and overturn the institutions of democracy. So I would say, as a political scientist, it's a fascinating time to see whether those institutions are holding and to see whether they will hold in other democracies, other developed democracies in Europe and in other parts of the world. So we're all part of a big experiment. I wish that I could just be an objective, neutral observer watching this experiment unfold, but unfortunately, I'm also a citizen and I have my own convictions. I really like liberal democracy. I think it is a good form of government. I think it's really the best alternative that's out there, and therefore I find it very upsetting to see the kinds of threats that have emerged from within, the core democratic countries that everybody had assumed would be pillars of stability, like Britain with the Brexit vote, and like my country, the United States, with the election of Trump. So I guess our discussion will go into further, I think, the reasons why this happened, and then some discussion of, what's likely, how this is likely to develop, and ways that we can push back against it. So I think with that, I'll sit down and look forward to our talk tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fukuyama, being with us here tonight in Hamburg. It's such a pleasure and also such an honor to have you here. discussing with you a topic. I read your famous essay when I was a young student in political science at in the early 90s. And I was impressed, and I always wondered, having followed your career over the last 30 years, does it bother you being recognized with just this one-liner?
It's bothered me right from the beginning, but I learned to get over it because, you know, I think that that's just the fate. That's how people knew me initially, and I spent a lot of time. I appreciate your explaining what the end of history was really about, because I usually have to do that, you know, with journalists and other people. But I can't do anything about it at this point, so it's just one of the conditions of life that I've got to accept.
In your new book, you come up with some remarkable numbers. You quote that in 1970, there were only like 35 electoral democracies. And then you say that in the early 2000s, we had a number of 120 electoral democracies.
That's right.
And something changed since then. What happened?
Well, I think several things happened. So one is the emergence of big authoritarian powers. The most important is China, obviously. It's now got the second largest economy in the world. It's stable. It looks like it's stable. It's increasingly aggressive in the South China Sea and other places. Russia is another one. So there's alternative models out there that seem to be relatively successful at a moment when Europe and America faced financial crises and internal turmoil. The overall number of democracies began falling sometime in the mid-2000s. So it may have gotten up to about 120, and every year there's been a regression in the overall level of democracy with you know, countries like Thailand or Pakistan going back into military rule and so forth. But as I indicated, I think the biggest threat, in a way, is the one that is internal to the most established democracies. The fact that you have these populist movements that have now appeared in virtually every modern advanced democracy. So the threat is coming from within, and it's something that is supported by an important part of the electorate in each of these countries. And so that, I think, even if the numbers actually haven't fallen that far, it's still over 100, but qualitatively, we're obviously living in a very different period where democracy no longer seems like the wave of the future. It seems like something else is trying to replace it, whether it's Viktor Orban's illiberal democracy or the China model or something else.
Before we are speaking about current politics, allow me to go back in history a little bit. You're quoting Rousseau. Thumos that you mentioned comes from Platon. Where would you say is the first place in history where we could identify something like identity politics?
Well, what I argue in my book is, I think, in a certain way, you can trace it back to Martin Luther. We celebrated his 500th, anniversary recently. Luther, I think, was important in the development of this idea because what he said was, what makes you a Christian is not your going to Mass or saying the Rosary or any external behavior. It is your inner faith. And only God can see, what's inside your soul. And so what is valuable is what's on the inside and not all of the social arrangements that the church had created, surrounding the believer. And I think that that was the moment at which you had a major Western thinker that elevated the inner person over the outer society. And that's been the structure of identity movements ever since then. So if you think about the Me Too movement, what are women saying in that movement? They're saying, we are not being respected. Our inner selves, we are whole human beings. We have talents and abilities and accomplishments and aspirations, but men are not treating us seriously as a whole human being. And as in the Protestant Reformation, the idea is not to make women conform to those external standards. The task is to change those external standards, to recognize the dignity that that they deserve. And so I think you see echoes of that, belief in the authenticity and the value of the inner self that really begins with the Reformation. And then with Rousseau and Kant, it begins to take a secular form, so it's not really tied to belief in the Christian religion. But I think that's, in a way, how we get to the present view of identity, that I have an identity, my value is inside me, it's not in the external society, and society needs to change.
And then there was an important moment when the French Revolution came in 1789, where we for the first time saw something like the dignity of an individual versus the dignity of a group.
So the French Revolution actually split in two directions. So one direction was a liberal one. It proclaimed the rights of man, that every citizen had rights, and that democracy was the expression of those rights. The other direction that the French Revolution took was also an identity direction towards nationalism, because in a way, modern European nationalism is born during the Revolution as France tried to defend itself against all of the foreign invaders that had tried to stop the revolution. And these two forms of identity, the individual universal identity of a liberal society and the national identity of a particular cultural group, then became the two major political currents of the 19th century. So here in Germany in 1848, it was another revolution, and there was a liberal version of it and there was a nationalist version. And those were the two that clashed, and ultimately, unfortunately, the national version ended up, the dominant one.
Would you go so far and identify Islamism, even Bin Laden and ISIS and these kinds of phenomena that we're facing from the Arab world as a specific way of identity politics?
I think that for many people who signed up with a radical Islamist group, identity was at the core of it, especially for a lot of young European Muslims, because they've got a big identity problem. They don't want to accept the identity of their parents or their grandparents, which is very traditional, comes from rural parts of Morocco or Pakistan or wherever their ancestors came from. But they're also they don't feel accepted in Europe. They don't feel like they've really joined the society where they're living in Rotterdam or Paris or wherever. So they have identity confusion, and what radical Islam provides them is meaning and community. And somebody that's saying, I'll tell you who you are, you're a Muslim, you're part of a ummah, a community of Muslims, we're being persecuted and despised around the world, and we offer you a way of fighting back against that. So I do think that psychologically there is an identity component to the attraction that this kind of radical Islamism holds for many young people.
You mentioned thumos, Platon's idea. That's somewhere here, right? You also mentioned megalothymia. Mm-hmm. Let me quote, the desire to be recognized as superior. Is megalothymia in these days part of almost every government? I mean, if we look at Xi, if we look at Erdogan, Putin, and Donald Trump in the White House, it looks like this is a very successful model right now for taking over whole countries.
Well, I think, so megalothymia, this desire to be recognized as superior, has always been the case in politics. I think that's why politicians go into politics. They want recognition. They want to be the boss. They want everybody to have look at them. The thing that has changed, however, is in a way the breakdown of constraints on megalothymia. So as I was saying, the reason we have a constitutional order and the reason we have rule of law is to prevent these kinds of individuals from endangering the society, the democratic order that they arise in, and that's those are the institutions that are now under stress. And so, in Hungary and Poland, the courts have been, there's been an effort to neutralize the courts by putting party members in judicial positions. There's a demonization and a buying of the press to prevent criticism from that quarter, stacking the bureaucracy with party militants, all of these sorts of things. So I think the megalothumia it's kind of a constant of politics, but the real danger right now is in the ability to constrain megalothumia.
It looks like liberal democracies sometimes appear to be too weak to fight back and push back against people like Erdogan, Putin, you mentioned Hungary, or is it only a temporary phenomenon?
We don't know. So before you get too pessimistic, you should think about some of the other things that have been going on in the world. So in Malaysia, you had an election where suddenly Najib is thrown out of power, and now it looks like he's going to go to jail for corruption. You've had basically an uprising that's been put down in in a very bloody form in Nicaragua. I think the regime in Venezuela is so bad that it looks like it's on its last legs. In Armenia, there is I think a pro-democratic uprising. So I think the people really don't like to live in authoritarian regimes, and I think that at a certain point, their legitimacy gets undermined by something. So I wouldn't count that impulse out completely. But right now, the momentum in this part of the world does seem to be in favor of these populists because they're the ones that have energy. The legitimacy of the established parties has been attacked, and then we're living in a different kind of information world in which there's no longer consensus even over basic facts, and so and that's something that's very useful for attacking the legitimacy of any established democratic party.
How would you explain the rise of identity politics over the last, let's say, 20 to 30 years, especially in Western liberal democracies?
I think that I accept the conventional wisdom that it starts with the economy. So we have a global economy that has been put in place by the European Union, by the United States in the the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that became the World Trade Organization. It worked the way the economists said it would. So we've had a quadrupling of global output between 1970 and, let's say, the crisis in 2008, which is really remarkable. So hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, China, India, all of these countries rising, and a lot of rich people appearing in virtually every part of the world. What hasn't happened is a general distribution of that wealth, particularly for less educated workers in rich countries. They've lost employment to China, to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, other places. And so that starts, that's the trigger, I think, that you've had stagnation in working class incomes. But the argument I'm making in identity is that that's not a sufficient explanation for why you're getting the kind of populism we're seeing. If it were just economics, you would expect there'd be a big left-wing populist movement that would rise up and say, oh, these capitalists have to be taxed and we have to have more redistribution. And instead, the left-wing parties almost everywhere have gotten weaker. And what you have instead is right-wing populism. These are the parties, the Tea Party in the United States, or the National Rally in France, or the AfD here in Germany. And I think the reason that the populism has taken this right-wing form is that the motivation of people is not simply economic. It's not simply redistribution from rich to poor. It really has to do with this identity issue, that people feel that they are disrespected and ignored by elites, and they're very angry about that. And they also feel that their national identity is being taken from them by immigrants, by foreigners, by other countries. And I think that's really why the right has been able to capitalize on this moment of economic distress in a way that the left has not been.
Well, allow me to add some numbers that I found during my research as a time as Washington correspondent. Between 1999 and 2016, the average household income in the United States has been decreasing from $57,000 a year to $52,000. So in a time where the Dow Jones index more than doubled,
yes.
The average household income was decreasing. And nowadays, the 400 richest American people own as much wealth as the lowest 60% of the
That's
population.
Right.
So that's those numbers are hard to believe. Interestingly, part of Trump's fan base is better situated. I think the average household income is around $70,000. So that would support your theory that it's not about the money. It's
well, it is about the money for some people. I think for his passionate working class base, these people have suffered economically. But you're right that many Trump voters are not factory workers that have lost a job in a manufacturing industry. They're more well-to-do, which I do think means that their motive does have to do with this identity question. There's also a really important gender dimension to this, because one of the things that's been happening in all modern economies as you shift from an industrial to an information economy is women are entering the workforce, and actually in a service sector job, if you're an employer, you're actually more likely to hire a woman than a man of equal skill, because the woman's going to be more reliable and, a better worker. So you have a kind of double hit, by these guys that were workers in a steel mill or an auto plant, that not only have they lost that job, but their wife is now the chief earner in their family.
Allow me to go back a little bit, maybe back to the 60s or somewhere after World War II. Wasn't identity politics at that time something which was necessary to break the glass ceiling in many cases?
So this is an important point that I want to emphasize. I think that all of the identity movements on the left for African Americans or minorities, racial minorities, for women, for gays and lesbians, all of these began with real social injustice. The mainstream society back in the 1960s, the early 1960s, was white and it was male, and none of these groups were receiving adequate recognition. They were suffering from segregation, from gender discrimination. All of these things are realities, and so they were perfectly right in saying, we as a group are suffering discrimination, and so we want restitution and we want, recognition of our particular cause. And so, yes, I think identity politics does begin with real social problems, and in many cases, it's really the only way to solve some of those social problems. Black Lives Matter starts over police violence, and it has led police departments around the United States to be much more careful. It's not solved the problem, but at least it's focused awareness that this is a problem and it's something that needs to be addressed.
Was the civil rights movement maybe the last universal, and if you want to say so, correct movement, because it addressed the rights of a majority of society?
Well, the civil rights movement went through an interesting evolution in the course of the 1960s. So Martin Luther King argued that black people ought to be treated the same way white people were, that their aspiration was to be the same, to enter the mainstream of American society. But I think subsequent versions of, the Black Power movement began to make a different kind of argument, saying, no, actually, we do not want to be just like white people, that black people have their own experience, their own culture. We don't simply want to blend in, but we want recognition of our way of life as equally valid, to that of other groups. This was even more true, I think, in the feminist movement. So it begins with a demand that women be paid equally and treated equally in the workplace. But I think there's a very important part of the movement that says, no, women are not the same as men. You know, women behave, they're better than men in many ways, which I would probably agree with in many respects. But we do not want to be, you know, we do not want to behave just the way men behave. We want, you know, we want recognition for the fact that we are actually different. And so every one of these groups, you know, began to evolve in a different way, where its group characteristics came to, you know, be seen as distinctive, and the demand was not that individuals be respected, but rather that the groups themselves receive an equal kind of respect.
You mentioned the gay movement. You refer to the gay movement also in your book, and you quote it as an example for identity politics. What's wrong here?
What's wrong?
Yeah.
I don't think anything's wrong. I think that, no, I mean, the example I was quoting was gay marriage, and why that's a dignity issue fundamentally. So there are economic issues attached to gay and lesbian unions, but you could have solved that through a civil, you know, a civil union. There are legal forms that would have allowed gays and lesbians to transmit property to, you know, to offspring and so forth. But that was not enough, because the issue really was equal dignity, that gays and lesbians wanted to have their unions recognized as being morally equivalent to a union between a man and a woman. And so the passion around gay marriage was that. Now, I actually think that people in liberal Western societies don't recognize how important this actually is for a lot of the populist movements that have appeared, beginning with Vladimir Putin, who's made a big deal about the fact that we in Russia are more traditional, we have Christian values, we're not like the decadent West that has permitted gay marriage. And so I think this issue for, you know, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, or for Orban, or for, you know, Erdogan, all of these populist movements actually have taken this as a symbol of what they don't want, that they don't want to be a liberal society if it involves accepting, you know, as equals, or accepting the equality of gay marriage.
An interesting example for the division of society into smaller and smaller groups is the LGBTQ star movement. I think there's something like 16 or 17 definitions of sexuality so far.
That's right.
How small can it get?
So, yeah, I don't know whether this is common in Germany, but certainly among my Stanford students, if you get an email, frequently at the end of the email, it will say, it will give the gender pronouns that define the way they want to be addressed, which sometimes doesn't correspond to their birth sexual, you know, birth sex. And you're right that there's been this proliferation, and in fact, a kind of belief in the transgender movement that gender is actually a completely socially constructed category that doesn't have anything to do with biology. And so this does lead to a constant fractioning of these identities into ones that are smaller and smaller, in effect, smaller and smaller groups of people. And they also set a lot of the groups against one another, because there's a lot of people in the lesbian movement that believe that women are actually different, and it's not just a matter of choice, as to what your gender identity is. So, I think those are some of the elements that make, that kind of identity politics very problematic.
You received the most harshest reactions on your book when you were in Stanford, speaking in front of that community, right?
Yeah, so there are audiences. I don't know whether this one tonight will be one of them, but there are certainly academic audiences where if I said what I just said, I would be thrown out of the room because, well...
it's civilized Hamburg here, so... Yeah. On the other hand, I think it is remarkable how harsh, bitter, and even full of hatred the reactions of the majority society are.
Yes.
In 2015, I remember well how I met Gavin Grimm, a transgender student living in Virginia, 16 or 17 years old. who transformed himself and wanted to use another bathroom. And he was cursed, and all his fellow students, or a lot of them, were full of hatred. How come that the majority society is often reacting with so much anger?
Well, it comes from a lot of sources. I think that, you know, many people in the traditional society see these kinds of social changes as threats in a way to their own identity, that somehow, you know, these small groups of people are changing the norms that everyone then, you know, has to accept, and that this is being done and pushed as an elite agenda where they really don't have a say. You know, it's done by Hollywood or by people in the arts or, you know, political elites. And I think that has fed into this narrative of being disrespected. Now, I think that it's important to, so, I mean, just to lay my cards on the table, you know, I have no problem with any of these identity claims, and I think, you know, mistreatment of anyone is a terrible thing. I think, however, that it's important when you're looking at populist voters that you not see them as a uniform group where they're all like the people that were cursing, you know, this particular young man, because I think that it's actually a very heterogeneous group, and so there's no question that for a certain core populist voter, they are driven by racism. You know, one of the big things that's going on in the United States is that it's turning into a so-called majority-minority country. In California, where I live, that's already happened, where white people are less than 50% of the, you know, the overall population. And there's a lot of white people that really don't like that, and you know, they want to hold on to the way that they thought of the United States as basically a, you know, a white country. So there's no question that that exists. There are other people, however, who feel disrespected by elites, and I think they have a greater legitimacy to those feelings of resentment, because the fact of the matter is that, you know, for, let's say, a factory worker that has lost a job or is working at a job at half the pay of his father or even grandfather, he's seen downward social mobility. It's very much like what happened to the black community back in the 1970s and 80s. In these white rural communities, you have broken families, you have increases in crime rates. There's an opioid epidemic, a drug epidemic that in 2017 was estimated to have killed over 70,000 Americans, so that actually male life expectancy in the United States has fallen, which is just remarkable for a rich, developed country, for life expectancy to actually fall. But it reflects, you know, the real problems that go on in those communities, and I think much of the anger that they feel is that neither political party, the mainstream media, people in the arts, you know, people that are the people that determine culture, have not paid attention to them. You know, that they've gone down this hole into a subclass, and nobody has cared about that. And that, I think, is also one of the things that's driven some of the anger that, you know, you were noting in the rallies that you were attending.
It was funny to see that after Trump's election in 2016, almost every major news outlet sent reporters to Fergus Falls, to Iowa, and somewhere. We're looking for exactly those people that you were mentioning. Similar things here. German newspapers sent reporters to North Rhine-Westphalia and the Lower Saxonia and Saxony and elsewhere on the search and to describe those people. But that's obviously not enough to bring back their dignity, isn't it?
No, I think that it's a much deeper phenomenon where there is a kind of cultural snobbery that, you know, that still exists. I think that, you know, in my university, it's very rare to find somebody that comes from a real working class background where nobody in the family had been to college. In fact, the way it works in an elite university like Stanford is you have two parents, they're both lawyers, or one's an entrepreneur and one's a doctor and they get married, and then their children get into Stanford because they've given the university a lot of money. And so you do have this cultural system now that becomes self-perpetuating, and if you're not born into it, it's really hard to break in. And I think it's a very serious social problem for us.
You mentioned the banking crisis in 2008 as a turning point. It's interesting to see that we had on the left the Occupy Wall Street movement and on the right the rise of the Tea Party. Why was it the Tea Party that succeeded and Occupy Wall Street deflated?
So I think it's two things. So one of them is what I was just saying about identity, that the Occupy movement did not make identity an issue, and I think that was what was angering a lot of people, whereas the Tea Party, I think, could capitalize on that feeling of loss of national identity and so forth. The other thing, frankly, is Occupy Wall Street was a bunch of kids that don't know what they're doing. They go to a protest and they get angry and so forth, but they said, we're not going to have an agenda, we're not going to create a political party. And so they didn't go to the next step, which is absolutely necessary in a democracy, which is to organize, to move from protest to actually electing candidates in the next election. And that's exactly what the Tea Party did. The Tea Party understood how the American system works. They ran candidates in every single congressional district, and within 2 years, they had taken over the Republican Party, and they had, taken over a large part of the U.S. Congress. By the way, that's one of the reasons why I don't think that the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement in France, is going to go anywhere, because they're a little bit like Occupy Wall Street. They like the protest part, but some of them are almost deliberately anti-institutional, so they don't want to create a party, and they're not really making the effort to organize themselves into a political party that can actually contest an election, partly because I think internally they don't agree on the agenda, whether they're actually on the left or on the right. So it's really not safe to make predictions, but I sort of think that this movement is going to peter out after a while for those reasons, very similar to the Occupy Wall Street movement.
There's this famous sentence from Bill Clinton, it's the economy is stupid. Following your argumentation, that's not what the left should apply to.
Identity stupid.
Would you say that Bernie Sanders understood that? Because if you attended his rallies, that was very much about identity. It was also about economy, but very much about identity. Would he have been maybe even the better candidate?
Well, he got to identity, but I think he got there a little bit late, because when he started his campaign, he actually was campaigning as a very traditional socialist or social democrat, wanting free college education and Medicare for all. These basically are economic policy issues, and he was not emphasizing gender, sexual identity, race, and he actually began running into activists in the Democratic Party that said, why aren't you talking more about Black Lives Matter and this sort of thing? And so I think he came to those issues a little bit late, and even today, I think there's suspicion of him on the part of some of these activist groups because he wasn't one of theirs, from the beginning. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, accepted that, if you looked at her website, what are the priorities for the campaign? Well, there's like 15 of them, and they all corresponded to the demands of particular identity groups that made up the Democratic Party coalition. I remember asking one of my friends who had been the Clintons' domestic policy advisor back when they were in the White House, why can't Hillary Clinton come up with 2 or 3 priorities that she'll say, this is what I'm going to do as president? And he said she can't do that because if you prioritize, items 1, 2, and 3, then items 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way to 15 are going to be angry. And they're going to say, why didn't you put us, up at the top of this list? And I think that, in a way, kind of suggests some of the problems that that party has with identity politics, because each one of these identity groups has a lobby and activists, and if you want to win an election, you kind of have to appeal to all of them.
So the simple recipe of just adding up all minorities doesn't work?
Well, it doesn't work in the sense that it doesn't give other voters that are not members of one of these groups a reason to vote for you. I think that, you know, the kind of broad appeals, the broad, simple appeals that would work with a lot of, you know, centrist or mainstream voters isn't on that list of 15. And that's why I think a lot of them, you know, tend to be turned off by that. Plus which there's an appearance that politicians are pandering to these particular groups, you know, and that gets into this issue of political correctness that, you know, quite frankly, so this big question, why does Donald Trump get to talk about women, you know, as he did in the Hollywood Access tape, and, you know, to be calling Mexicans rapists and criminals and get away with it? And I think it's this complicated psychology where a lot of people are so annoyed by the language that politicians feel they have to use so as to avoid giving offense to the dignity of any particular group that they end up not saying anything, you know, meaningful. And here was a politician that was authentic. And so I know a lot of Trump supporters would say, you know, maybe I don't agree with what he said, but at least he's willing to say it, and he's not intimidated by, you know, by the charge of being politically correct. And he's now turned that into a into a profession. You know, he loves insulting people, and I think that's one of the real problems we're going to have in the United States, because once you start breaching those conventions as to what's acceptable to say and what's not, I'm not sure you're going to be able to restore them that easily. And so it's going to be much easier for the next politician to come along and say things that are, you know, sexist or racist or, you know, xenophobic.
Well, we see similar phenomena here as well. If you look what the AfD is doing, Alexander Gauland, the party chairman, who speaks about Vogelschiss, about the 12 years of National Socialism and similar things. You also see this similar, maybe not in the same dimension, but a similar phenomenon.
Yeah.
Allow me to get back to what you said about money, wealth, and welfare state. If it's not about shifting wealth from the rich to the poor, that's terrible news for the social democrats here, isn't it?
Yes, it is, except that it seems to me one of the problems of the SPD is that they actually weren't social democratic enough, you know, ever since they went into coalition, you know, with the conservatives, and, you know, presiding over austerity and, you know, these reforms to the labor market under Schroeder. I think a lot of people said, well, what's the point of voting for a left-wing party if they're going to be the party of austerity? You know, they're no different from the conservatives, and they weren't offering a real alternative. And so I do think that there probably is an opportunity for, you know, a more genuinely left position to emerge. It's certainly happening big time now in the United States with the emergence of, you know, all of these new leaders or presidential candidates that are now outbidding themselves to, you know, be more left-wing than, you know, want higher taxes on rich people and so forth.
I heard that you met Olaf Scholz this morning.
Yes.
Did you tell him that?
It's not my business to come to a foreign country and tell the finance minister
Oh, you're so polite, Francis.
How he should run his political life. I think that's not my role.
So something like raise the minimum wage, that's not a political recipe that you would recommend to address?
No, I think that, look, all of these things are I would be happy if the left returned to arguing about how much redistribution to do, because that's an argument I think that you can have a real discussion over. I would say I don't like a lot of the proposals that are coming out of the left wing of the Democratic Party right now because I don't think we can afford them, and I don't think they're sustainable fiscally, but I agree completely that we ought to raise taxes on rich people in the United States. There's no question about that.
70%?
That's the kind of good argument to have. I don't think 70% is the right number, but right now it's like 35%, and it could be 40, 45%. You know, there is a number there that I think would be much more appropriate. We have these ridiculous aspects of our tax code. So there's something called the carried interest provision in the US tax code that allows the owners of hedge funds to pay only a 15% tax rate. There's no moral justification for this whatsoever, but because of lobbyists and the influence of Wall Street on Congress, we can't get rid of it. So there's lots of things that we can do. So I'm all in favor of a broad redistributive effort. I think the discussion really ought to be what of that is sustainable over the long run, and what is going to lead to really big problems down the road when we promise things that we're not going to be able to deliver on.
Leaving aside advice for the left, what can we do as a society?
So this is the part that I guess I get the most resistance from when I speak here in Germany and other parts of Europe, because I actually think that there has to be a refocusing on what I call a civic national identity. I think that especially in Germany, because of Germany's historical experience in the 20th century, anything with the word nation in it has a bad connotation. But I actually think that national identity is a necessary condition. It's a sine qua non of having a democracy, because people have to believe that they are part of the same community, and they have to have a sufficient degree of trust that they can interact in a democratic institutional setting. And therefore, you need something like an identity that is based on ideas, that's based on constitutionalism, on the rule of law, on the principle of equality. It cannot be based on ethnicity, because our modern societies are already too diverse for that to be the case. It cannot be based on religion, because again, we don't have agreement on religious issues. Even back in the 16th century, they didn't agree that much on religious matters. So national identity can't be built around ethnicity. It can't be built around religion. It can be built around democratic ideas. And I think that that is something very important. It does not necessarily evolve into old-fashioned nationalism and aggression and intolerance. Canada, Australia, Singapore, these are all countries that have national identities, and they don't spend their time invading their neighbors. So I think that this is something that is important, and I think many countries in Europe have been wrestling with this question of how do you include people in that national identity, given the existing diversity, and yet make it emotionally compelling, substantive, and so forth. And so that, I think, is that's the general piece of advice I would give, that we need this focus. So an immediate question that has been raised in many of the audiences I've had here is why a national identity? Why not European identity? And my answer to that is, it would have been nice if Europe had been able to create an identity that would displace all of the national identities of the member states of the European Union, but it seems to me that's just not realistic. It hasn't happened. And it's not likely to happen given the current political climate, and given that you still need some way of integrating people into a larger whole, and I think at the moment that remains at a national level. And so that's the broad direction I think that politics needs to move in, and it's something I think that political leadership can bring about.
For Germany, you have a specific advice. You advocate for revitalizing the term Leitkultur. I think we've been there before.
Yeah.
It didn't go well.
Leitkultur, so I am a friend of Bassam Tibi, who invented that term.
In the early 2000s.
In the early 2000s. And my support for it is based on his understanding of what that was, because I think that what he was describing is something like what I just described to you. It was a civic identity or a creedal identity that was based on Enlightenment principles of tolerance, openness, equality, rule of law, and that you needed to build a common culture around ideas like that. Now, it was used by the Christian Democrats in ways that, made it problematic in the eyes of, many Germans. But I think the underlying concept that Bassam Tibi had is a correct one.
It looked like neither the left nor the right was mature enough at the time to adopt it and shape it in a progressive way, wasn't it?
But I think now you have a real crisis, because you have a right that wants to redefine national identity in old-fashioned ethnic terms. And that needs to be combated. We have the same thing in the United States. We have the rise of this alt-right, so-called alt-right, or white nationalists that want to redefine American national identity, again, in racial terms. So someone like me is not part of that identity. And that's a terrible thing. And I think that's, so that's why I think something like Leitkultur is necessary at the present moment.
What about Jürgen Habermas' term of Verfassungspatriotismus, patriotism of the Constitution? Or is there not enough thumos in it?
Not enough thumos. So Verfassungspatriotismus has to be the core of this identity, right? That's the basic agreement. That's the social contract that unites people in a democratic Germany. The problem is that by itself, it's probably not enough to, you can assent to that intellectually, but you don't have this emotional attachment to, to that kind of an identity. And so I think it needs to be supplemented by other sorts of symbols and, attractive associations. And again, that's, what I think political leaders need to do. I give this one example in my book of the movie Invictus, where Nelson Mandela in 1996 was president of South Africa. The country was obviously completely divided along identity lines, where the blacks played football and the whites played rugby. And they were hosting the Rugby World Cup that year, and Nelson Mandela wanted his fellow black Africans to support the national rugby team, even though it was an all-white team. And the African National Congress resisted it. They said, why should we support these racists? But I think Mandela's vision was that sport is one of those things that actually creates a sense of identity and common purpose. And it was important to get black and white South Africans to root for the same team. By the way, in the United States, the sport of baseball was actually deliberately created in the 1870s as a means of trying to heal the divisions between the North and the South that had just fought this terrible civil war. And, it worked in many ways. I mean, it gave Americans, something else to think about other than the resentment that had arisen out of that war. So, that's not going to be the solution for any country, sports. I mean, but it's kind of an indication of what it would mean to go beyond a simple intellectual assent to something that, is more emotionally attractive.
I have a lot of sympathy for your thoughts. I'm not sure if it will be enough to reach out to the voters, especially on the right wing, be it here or be it in the United States. Maybe we have reached a point where it's just too late to create such a unity?
I hope not. I mean, the other area, I think, in which you can reach out to that kind of voter is in immigration policy or migration policy. I think that neither Europe nor the United States has a correct system right now. And I think this is a really important political point, because there's a tendency on the left to say that everyone that is opposed to immigration is simply a racist. And I don't think that that's actually correct. I think that there is a core of racists that just don't like foreigners. There's another group that worry about the fact that a lot of the migration is illegal, that the state is not in control as to who crosses into their country. And then there's another group of people that worry about the ability of the society to actually integrate culturally different people so that they feel that they're part of a larger whole. And I think the second and third of those concerns are actually legitimate. A democracy really does need to be able to control its own borders, and you do need to worry about, you don't want immigrant communities to grow up as parallel societies that really have nothing to do with the, with the mainstream society. So you need a strategy for integration. And so my policy advice for my country, and I would say for Europe as well.
Now we get back to policy advice.
Yeah, we get back to policy, but my policy advice is part of the way you have to break up that anti-immigrant bloc by doing things that are morally justified, and so that includes, having a system of laws that you can actually enforce and having a strategy for actively integrating newcomers into your society. And I think if you do that the way Canada does or Australia, you may be able to diffuse at least some of the anti-immigrant feeling.
You come up with an interesting suggestion. You suggest something like a single citizenship for whole Europe. Is that realistic?
No. No, I don't think it's realistic. I think that was implicit in the whole post-national project of Europe, and I think that was an aspiration towards which Europe was going. But I think that given the real differences between European members of the EU at the moment, I just don't see that happening.
Francis, before we open the floor for questions, and we have two microphones here over there, and I think one over there, I can't let you go as the grandmaster of predictions without an outlook regarding the upcoming election in the United States. Who on the Democratic side has the best chances? Will we see a candidate who is tapping into identity politics, or will we see someone who is representing the overall party majority? What do you think?
Well, I don't know, and this is going to be a big fight within the Democratic Party. I think that, as far as I'm concerned, a good candidate would have to have a way of appealing to some of those white working class voters that used to vote Democratic and started to vote Republican. You have to have a way of getting them back, which means you're going to need a more centrist person ideologically. I think that Donald Trump has a big problem because he is not appealing, his popularity, we were discussing, when we were sitting waiting for the talk, it's now up to the low 40s, but he has a great deal of trouble getting it higher than that. And his negative ratings are more than 50%. A lot of people really, really dislike him. So his fundamentals are not good. The only way that he's going to get elected is if the Democrats pick a candidate that appears to be too much in the identity politics mode or too left-wing in economic policy. And right now, that's a real danger. They could do that. My personal favorite, I like somebody like Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota, because she's a woman, so that's very important because a lot of women are really angry at Donald Trump right now. But she's also, I think, more sensible, I think, on her economic policy agenda. So she's progressive, but she doesn't want, she's not calling for a 70% tax rate on rich people. And so, but we'll have to see because we have a long way to go before we see a resolution to this.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have the unique chance to address your questions to Francis Fukuyama. I see one here, and please be so kind and introduce yourself.
Good evening, my name is Klaus Matzia from Hoffmann & Kamp X. Thanks for the really great points you're making, and thanks also for speaking truth to power and said that you're talking to an European audience and telling the European audience maybe something that they are not really happy to hear. So my question is technology. I keep wondering, how much would you rate technology as a danger or as a catalyst, really, that increases the conflicts between identity groups? And if you do, what can we do about it?
Well, that's actually the subject of a big research project that I started with a few of my colleagues at Stanford, since we're sitting in the middle of Silicon Valley. I think that you had this coincidence where you had the rise of populism that occurred at the same time as the appearance of social media, and the two of them are obviously related to one another. What we don't know is what the causal relationship is, whether technology is driving the populism or vice versa. But they clearly go together, because social media allows you to talk to people that have the same view that you do, and to cut out views of anybody else that you don't want to hear from. And it also has been weaponized, not just by Putin, but by a lot of groups on the far right, both in Europe and in the United States, who can use it to deliberately spread false information, to undermine the credibility of otherwise very legitimate, opponents and the like. What we do about it is, I think, going to be a mixture of regulation and self-regulation. I think that, most Americans go around complaining about, the European Competition Commissioner and, the hostility of Europe to American technology companies. I think Europe is actually doing God's work right now in trying to take on, Facebook and Google, because I think that these two private companies should not have as much power as they do. It's not safe to have basically a monopolist, that can make these big decisions over what to carry and what not to carry and so forth. And so I think, we need to make these companies smaller. I think they need to be regulated. I think GDPR, the privacy rules that Europe has promulgated, ought to be adopted in some form in the United States. So I think a combination of, these different measures will hopefully do something to, to deal with this problem. Hopefully.
Over there, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fukuyama. I'm a free journalist writing for Chinese newspapers. And, well, I have a lot of questions, but one question maybe is the one that I want to ask, because now in Germany and Europe, there's a lot of discussion talking about competition between different political systems. And what I can see that what you described here in the European or Western democratic countries, that the two measures, for example, the economic measures and identity measures are actually, not going that well. But I can see in China, the Chinese government are trying to apply these two measures very, I would say, very well to create a strong China identity for the people, and at the same time also improve dramatically their living standards. And what will you see to this debate started in Germany, that the competition of two systems, or what do you see and how do you suggest the Europeans, how they could cooperate with China, or how could they, my view is that to take China as a partner but not as a competitor. What is your view of that? Thank you very much.
Well, that's a subject for a separate lecture. First of all, I do not think that China is dealing with identity questions terribly well, right? China, in the last year or so, has put about 1 million Uyghurs into essentially camps, internment camps. They're not dealing with Tibet. Tibet does not have an opportunity to express its particular identity under the Chinese system. I think that under Xi Jinping, I have a lot of Chinese friends who are extremely disappointed, because they were hoping that under Xi Jinping the country would liberalize. They would have more individual freedom, ability to criticize the government, to say what they wanted, And it's gone in exactly the opposite direction, that under Xi Jinping, it's become not just a stricter dictatorship, but with the social credit system, China is now using big data and machine learning and all of these new AI techniques to control the behavior of all 1.2 billion of its citizens in a way that no authoritarian regime has ever attempted, before. And so I guess given, the fact that it's moving in terms of democratic values in exactly the wrong direction, I'm not surprised that we're seeing a lot of competition that is verging on, outright conflict in some areas. And I think that, unfortunately, this is going to probably accelerate and get worse before it gets better. But I really do think that the problem is in the, the business community, for example. I remember talking to Dieter Wuttke, who is the head of the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing. The attitude of European businessmen towards China has changed 180 degrees because they don't feel they've been treated fairly in a reciprocal manner. So I think all of these are contributing to, an increasingly unpleasant and competitive relationship with China. I think we ought to work at that because I don't think that's healthy, but I do think there are good reasons why that, situation has emerged.
But there's an interesting point. You mentioned Russia and China as well, and we see a kind of national identity in politics, but we don't see breaking up society in smaller and smaller groups of certain sub-identities, don't we?
Well, so there is a big identity question in the Russian Federation. This is one area where the Russians have actually done pretty well. Whatever form of nationalism Putin represents, it's not an ethnically based, exclusive kind of identity because, 20% of his population are not ethnic Russians. There are lots of Muslims in the Russian Federation. And, there's a citizenship that is not based on your race, So in that respect, there's certain liberal aspects to the way that he has conceived identity. He's not particularly anti-Semitic. He's gone out of his way, in fact, to cultivate good ties with Israel. So it's a little bit of a complicated situation with him. As I said, China is a different case where I do think there actually is identity politics. It's just that it's all suppressed, by an authoritarian government.
I saw a couple of other hands. So the woman over there.
I'm Maren Tomford. I'm a cultural social anthropologist, and I just wanted to ask you what you think about the even younger kids who stand up nowadays in order to demonstrate against our ecological destructive system, who skip schools on Friday and just try to make us aware of what we are doing right now and that we need to change dramatically. What do you think about these kids?
Well, I'm in favor of doing something, about climate change, and so there's lots of ways of mobilizing people. Whether it's worth skipping school if you're a 12-year-old, that I don't know, but in general, I think that it's essentially a political issue because right now the United States is taking a completely wrong position on climate. There's a climatologist that I read, whose blog I read, Daniel Swain, and before the election, he was asked, what's the advice you would give to somebody that's worried about climate change, about what kinds of policies to support, and he said the single most important thing you can do is vote, right? Because that's the way you change things in a democratic society, and so that has to be the mechanism by which you change people's minds and you change policies.
There was another hand over there, please.
Hello, my name is Nonya Oranu, and I'm a social psychologist, and I adopted Stephen Reicher's model of leadership based on social identity or identity energy. More or less blindly, because in your book I stumbled over the fact that for the first time nowadays we see the individual movement for public recognition of identity themes as a political topic. So I wanted to ask if the public recognition, the isotymos, is actually a political question. Why do we need a political, which often corresponds with a legal change, to accept or to define those identities?
Well, I think it's natural that you go into politics to get that kind of recognition, because, you know, changing a law or you know, being a leader that speaks about a particular identity issue is the way you get recognition. So, I mean, again, go back to the gay marriage issue. Could this have been solved without actually changing the law on marriage to allow marriages between gays and lesbians? I don't think so, because it was a dignity and a recognition issue that depended completely on the public affirmation through the legal system of the equal dignity of those kinds of unions. So I think it's natural that you know, it entered into politics. Now, not all identity issues, you know, need that, but I think that you know, because politics is one of the ways that we do recognize one another, you know, there is a kind of natural move to, you know, to use politics as a vehicle for recognition.
There's another hand.
Hello, first of all, good evening, sir, and thank you for your insights. I was just wondering what you think, or how you think that the Chinese One Belt policy is going to impact the democratization process of those countries impacted by it.
I'm not sure that it has an impact on democracy per se. I actually just completed a study of Chinese infrastructure projects, you know, around the world. So it's something I've thought about a fair amount. I think the problem is that the Chinese are not very good investors in many respects, or they're willing to take risks on projects that no Western consortium would consider touching, because they want the influence that, you know, these kinds of projects provide. And that's led them into these situations like in Sri Lanka or now in Venezuela, where they're way overextended and the client countries owe them a lot of money that they're not going to be able to pay back. And you know, what they've done in Sri Lanka is get a 99-year lease on a port there that then worries the Indians and, you know, other players in that part of the world. But it's not good for the country, and it doesn't matter whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship. The problem, I think, is the Chinese are willing to deal with anybody, and a lot of the agreements were made with people like Rajapaksa, the previous, you know, prime minister in Sri Lanka, who himself was extremely corrupt. So he and his brothers profited from these Chinese projects, but the country as a whole did not. So it's not that it's undermining democracy, but it's undermining the country as a whole, and it makes use of, you know, corruption and non-democratic means in order to, you know, to spread that kind of influence.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yes. The gentleman in the second row, please. Okay. We have time for both.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fukuyama, for a wonderful evening. It's been very invigorating to hear you talk about various things. Thank you also for mentioning Sri Lanka. I'm a Sri Lankan. And you're absolutely right. Mr. Rajapaksa was a very corrupt prime minister or president who ruined the country by borrowing so much money from the Chinese. But that's another story. You mentioned that Amy Klobuchar would be an ideal candidate for presidency. But there are many others who probably are just as good or even maybe better. One name comes to mind is Kamala Harris. I'm not sure what you think about her. But whatever happens, I think all of us are agreed on the fact that 4 years of Donald Trump is enough, and somebody else has to take over. But my worry is that the Democratic candidates are costing each other the votes and the chances to succeed. How can they get over this problem of an inflation of candidacy?
Well, you know, it's a little heretical to say this, but I think that one way they could do it is by getting rid of popular primaries and going back to having the party pick the candidate. That's how Abraham Lincoln was picked. You know, that's how Theodore Roosevelt was picked. That's how Franklin Roosevelt was picked. But, you know, since the 1970s, there's been an opening up of the process to popular votes, and it makes it completely impossible to predict who's going to win, but it also biases the selection in favor of activists because they're the only ones that vote in a primary, and they're almost always more extreme than the average voter in the party. So that means more left-wing in the Democratic Party and more right-wing in the Republican Party. So unfortunately, we're not going to abolish primaries. In fact, we're moving towards more popular participation, but this is one of those areas where democratic reform actually has a contrary effect to what had been hoped for.
There's one final question here in the front row, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Katja Gloger, journalist and writer specializing on Russia. Thank you so much for your insights, Mr. Fukuyama. I want to take you back to Europe and the European Union, as apparently very important elections are awaiting us in May for the European Parliament. And we apparently have an identity problem with the European Union, because we see more and more governments and countries getting more and more right-wing, getting more and more populist, Estonia being the last example a couple of days ago. So at what point do we as Europeans defending certain democratic values, at what point do we draw the red line? Otherwise, Europe will fall apart, won't it?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult question that I don't have nearly enough, I think, contextual knowledge, about European politics to really answer successfully. So, for example, the move to oust Viktor Orban from the EPP, I think this should have been done years ago, quite frankly, and I understand Angela Merkel's reasons for not doing. I think that was a big mistake. Should that happen now? Well, it's complicated because if he's ousted from the EPP, he may join the more right-wing party, and if they do well in the European election, they may end up, as the second most powerful party in the European Parliament, and that's not a good outcome either. So I am really reluctant to give advice on this because, to what extent do you make an alliance with a far-right party like Sebastian Kurz has done in Austria? I think there's probably a red line that should have been drawn there, but you can make an argument that, if you tame these people or draw them into the mainstream, you may defang them, and that has actually worked in some cases. The True Finn Party, was treated that way. So, like I said, this is a really complicated set of issues, and I really don't feel that I'm qualified to give you any advice on that.
Francis Fukuyama, it was such a pleasure and such an honor to have you here in Hamburg and discuss with us the maybe most important political topic of these days. Thanks so much for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, it was great to have you here on behalf of die Körber Stiftung, Hoffmann und Campe und die Zeit. Kommen Sie gut nach Hause, bleiben Sie uns gewogen und auf bald. Vielen Dank.